Sometimes a marriage doesn't end when someone leaves. Sometimes it ends when one person stops being seen. The wedding ring rested in the center of the desk, catching the glow of a single lamp in the vast silence of the royal study. Alpha King Theron Veilcrest stared at it without moving. For a moment, his mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. The ring was familiar. Too familiar. A simple silver band with a tiny moonstone set into its surface. He had placed it on Aurelia Whitemore's finger 7 years ago beneath a moonlit sky, while hundreds of wolves cheered the union of their future king and Luna. Aurelia never took it off. Not during winter storms. Not during ceremonies. Not during the long nights when he returned home after midnight, exhausted and distracted. She wore it every day as if the promise it represented mattered more to her than anything else in the world. Yet now it sat alone on his desk. The room felt strangely cold. Theron glanced toward the doorway, expecting her to appear at any moment with that calm smile she always carried. Maybe she had removed it for some reason. Maybe she was upset. Maybe she wanted his attention. The thought almost made him laugh. Aurelia had never demanded attention. That had always been the problem. Outside the tall windows, rain drifted softly across the palace grounds. Midnight had come and gone hours ago. The kingdom slept beneath dark clouds while the king remained surrounded by reports, maps, and unfinished decisions. He rubbed a hand across his jaw and finally noticed the envelope resting beside the ring. His name was written across the front in Aurelia's elegant handwriting. Theron frowned. She never left letters. If she needed something, she simply waited until he had time to listen. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Waited. How often had she waited? He reached for the envelope but paused before touching it. Something felt wrong. Deeply wrong. A strange unease crept through him. For years Aurelia had been a constant presence in his life. Quiet, reliable, steady as the moon above their kingdom. She greeted guests, comforted grieving families, organized charity events, visited villages forgotten by nobles, solved problems before they ever reached his attention. She was always there, so constant, in fact, that he had stopped noticing how much space she occupied. Until now. Until her absence suddenly felt larger than the palace itself. Theron pushed back from the desk and stood. The study seemed unnaturally silent. No sound of footsteps in the hallway. No soft humming drifting from her private sitting room. No faint scent of lavender tea waiting in the corner. He crossed the room and opened the door. The corridor beyond stood empty beneath golden chandeliers. Aurelia? His voice echoed farther than he expected. No answer came. A servant appeared at the far end of the hallway and quickly lowered her gaze. Your Majesty? Where is Luna, Aurelia? The young woman hesitated. Just for a second. But Theron noticed. I thought she was with you, Your Majesty. The unease deepened. Theron walked quickly through the palace. First her garden. Empty. Then the library where she often spent evenings reading beside the fireplace. Empty. Then the eastern balcony overlooking the river. Empty. Every place carried traces of her presence, but none contained the woman herself. He eventually reached her private chambers. The room was spotless, organized, peaceful, almost untouched. Yet something felt missing. He opened her wardrobe. Several dresses remained. Several were gone. A travel cloak was missing. So was a leather journal she kept near her bed. Theron's heartbeat slowed in a way that frightened him more than panic would have. This was not an impulsive decision. This was preparation. His eyes drifted toward the vanity mirror. There, resting neatly beside a small vase of white flowers, lay another item he immediately recognized. A framed portrait from their first year of marriage. The glass had been removed. The photograph itself was gone. Theron stood frozen. For the first time that night, a terrible possibility entered his mind. Aurelia had not wandered away. She had not gone for a walk. She had not left for the evening. She had left him. Back in the study, the wedding ring waited beneath the lamp exactly where she had placed it. Small, silent, final. And for the first time in 7 years, Theron Veilcrest realized he had absolutely no idea where his Luna was. The letter felt heavier than any royal decree Theron had ever held. For several long seconds, he simply stared at Aurelia's handwriting, tracing the familiar curves of each letter with his eyes. Countless times he had seen those elegant strokes on invitations, charity records, holiday cards, and messages left for palace staff. Yet tonight the sight of them filled him with a strange sense of dread. Slowly, he broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The scent of lavender lingered faintly on the page. His chest tightened before he even read the first line. Theron, if you are reading this, Then I finally found the courage to do something I should have done years ago. The king lowered himself into the chair behind the desk. Rain tapped softly against the windows as his eyes moved across the page. Do not worry. I am safe. I am not lost. I am not angry. That sentence stopped him. Not angry. Somehow those two words hurt more than if she had filled every line with accusations. Aurelia continued. I spent many years convincing myself that being patient was the same thing as being happy. I believed that if I waited long enough, there would come a day when we would sit together and talk the way we used to before crowns, duties, and endless meetings stood between us. But waiting became a habit. Then it became my life. Theron swallowed hard. Memories surfaced without warning. Aurelia standing at the palace entrance as he departed for another diplomatic summit. Aurelia waiting beside a dining table long after dinner had grown cold. Aurelia smiling gently whenever he apologized and promised he would make time soon. Soon. The word echoed through his mind. Soon had become 7 years. His eyes returned to the letter. This is not your fault alone. I should have spoken honestly much sooner. Instead, I became very good at pretending everything was fine. Everyone praised me for being a perfect Luna. They never realized I was slowly disappearing. Theron lowered the paper. The room suddenly felt smaller. Across from the desk sat the empty chair where Aurelia often spent quiet evenings reading while he worked. He could almost see her there now, turning pages beneath the warm light while occasionally glancing up just to smile at him. How many nights had she spent only a few feet away while feeling completely alone? The thought settled heavily over him. He continued reading. I think the saddest part is that I never stopped loving you. If I had, leaving would have been easier. Theron closed his eyes. A sharp ache spread through his chest. For the first time since finding the ring, he understood that this was not a sudden decision. This letter was not the result of one argument, one misunderstanding, or one difficult week. It was the final page of a story that had been unfolding quietly for years while he looked elsewhere. A knock sounded at the door. Theron folded the letter and looked up. His advisor, Malcolm Reed, stepped inside. The older man immediately noticed the king's expression. Your Majesty, the palace guard has completed a preliminary search. Theron stood, and Malcolm hesitated. No sign of Luna Aurelia within the capital. Silence followed. What else? Theron asked. Malcolm shifted uneasily. Several servants reported that she spent the last few months organizing records and transferring responsibilities. She prepared detailed instructions for every charity project she managed. Theron stared at him. Months. Yes, Your Majesty. The word struck like a bell. Months. Aurelia had been preparing for this for months, perhaps longer. Not one person had informed him because no one believed it unusual. After all, Luna Aurelia was always helping someone, always planning ahead, always making everyone's lives easier. Malcolm cleared his throat. There is one more thing. He placed a small ledger on the desk. This belonged to the Luna. Theron opened it. Inside were lists of names, donations, village visits, and personal notes. Page after page documented efforts that had improved lives across the kingdom. Families receiving assistance. Schools repaired. Elderly citizens cared for. Young wolves given scholarships. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of stories. Theron stared at the pages in disbelief. He had signed budgets. Aurelia had changed lives. As dawn slowly brightened the horizon beyond the rain-covered windows, the Alpha King stood alone in the study holding the ledger in one hand and her letter in the other. For years he had believed he understood the woman he married. Tonight he discovered a painful truth. He knew her title. He knew her duties. He knew her smile. But he had never truly seen how much of his kingdom rested quietly in the hands of the woman who was now gone. 3 days passed after Aurelia left the palace. Theron slept little. Every room seemed to remind him of her absence. The palace remained as beautiful as ever. Servants moved through the halls. Advisors delivered reports. Meetings continued. Yet beneath the appearance of normal life, something felt profoundly wrong. On the 4th morning, Theron found himself standing outside a small sitting room he had not entered in months. Perhaps longer. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Books lined the shelves. Fresh flowers rested in ceramic vases. A half-finished knitting project sat beside a chair near the fireplace. Everything inside reflected Aurelia. Warm, thoughtful, quietly alive. He stepped into the room and immediately noticed a wooden cabinet against the far wall. For reasons he could not explain, he opened it. Inside were dozens of journals arranged neatly by year. Curiosity gave way to unease as he pulled one free. The cover read simply, Plans. Theron sat down and opened it. The first page stopped him cold. Saturday, dinner with Theron. A small heart had been drawn beside the words. Below it, a single line crossed through the entry. Cancelled. Theron frowned and turned the page. Sunday, walk through the gardens with Theron. Crossed out. The next page. Spring festival with Theron. Crossed out. Another page. Picnic by the river. Crossed out. He flipped forward more quickly. Month after month. Year after year. The same pattern repeated. Small plans. Simple moments. Things most people would barely remember. Every one carefully written. Every one eventually crossed out. Theron felt his chest tighten. There were hundreds of entries. Hundreds. Some pages contained little notes beside the cancellations. Important council meeting. Diplomatic emergency. Budget review. Delayed until next week. The excuses sounded painfully familiar because many of them had come directly from him. His eyes settled on an entry from 4 years earlier. Anniversary dinner. Reservation confirmed. A tiny pressed flower remained tucked beside the page. The entire entry had been crossed out. Theron remembered that evening. A trade dispute had demanded his attention. He had sent his apologies and promised they would celebrate another time. Looking at the page now, he realized another time never came. Slowly, he reached for a second journal. This one contained ticket stubs, concerts, charity galas, seasonal festivals, local theater performances. Every ticket had been purchased for 2 people. Most had never been used. A small note sat beside one pair of tickets. Maybe next year. Theron lowered the journal. A strange ache settled inside him. Aurelia had never demanded expensive gifts. She had never asked for grand displays of affection. All she wanted was time. Real time. Shared time. The kind of thing he kept postponing because there would always be another meeting, another responsibility, another urgent matter waiting on his desk. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Clara entered carrying fresh flowers. She paused when she noticed the journals. Her expression softened immediately. You found them. Theron looked up. You knew about these? Clara nodded sadly. The Luna bought a new planner every year. Theron glanced back at the shelves. There were 7 journals. One for every year of their marriage. She never stopped planning things for us, he said quietly. Clara hesitated before answering. She never stopped hoping. Silence filled the room. Theron stared at the crossed-out entries. The evidence of disappointment stretched across years. Not dramatic arguments. Not betrayal. Something somehow worse. Repeated absence. Missed moments. Forgotten promises. Clara placed the flowers near the window. Do you know what the Luna used to do after a cancellation? Theron shook his head. She would smile and tell everyone you were busy. Clara looked away. Then she would sit by the window until late at night anyway. The words struck harder than any accusation. Theron suddenly remembered countless evenings returning to the palace long after dark. He had often seen a light glowing from this room. He never thought much about it. Now he understood. Aurelia had been waiting. Again and again. Year after year. His gaze drifted toward the final journal on the shelf. Unlike the others, it was nearly empty. Only one recent entry appeared on the first page. Dinner with Theron. The date was 3 weeks before she left. No angry note followed. No complaint. No crossed-out words. Just a blank space beneath the entry. Theron stared at it for a long time. Then he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked inside the back cover. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. I think the hardest part is not feeling unloved. It is wondering how long someone can wait before they disappear. Theron lowered the paper. For the first time since finding the wedding ring, he understood something that frightened him far more than her absence. Aurelia had not left because she stopped loving him. She left because she finally stopped believing he would choose her. The next morning, Theron left the palace before sunrise. For the first time in years, he traveled without a ceremonial escort, without banners, and without the grand procession expected of a king. Only Malcolm accompanied him as far as the capital gates. Beyond that point, Theron intended to continue alone. The kingdom stretched before him beneath a pale gray sky. Cool autumn air carried the scent of pine and distant rain. As he guided his horse onto the northern road, he carried only a travel pack, Aurelia's letter, and a growing determination that refused to let him turn back. His first destination was Pine Hollow, a small village mentioned repeatedly throughout Aurelia's records. The journey covered nearly 70 miles through rolling hills and dense forests. Along the way, Theron found himself noticing things he had ignored for years. Repaired bridges, new schoolhouses, community gardens, fresh paint on buildings that once appeared neglected. At first he thought little of it. Then he began recognizing names from Aurelia's ledger. Every improvement seemed connected to her efforts in some way. By late afternoon, he arrived in Pine Hollow. The village sat beside a narrow river surrounded by golden maple trees. Children played near the town square, while merchants closed market stalls for the evening. Several villagers recognized him immediately, but instead of excitement, he noticed surprise. Not because their king had arrived, because he had arrived alone. An elderly woman stepped forward from a nearby porch. Her silver hair was tied neatly beneath a blue scarf. Theron recognized her name from the notes pinned to Aurelia's community board. "Mrs. Holloway?" he asked. The woman blinked in surprise. "Your Majesty knows my name?" Theron almost laughed at the irony. "I know someone who does." The woman's expression softened instantly. "The Luna?" Theron nodded. For a moment neither spoke. Then Mrs. Holloway smiled sadly. "She visited every month. Did she mention where she might go if she ever left the palace?" The question sounded strange even to him. The woman thought carefully before shaking her head. "No, but she often spoke about finding peace." Theron frowned. "Peace?" Mrs. Holloway gazed toward the river. She always asked others how they were doing. Nobody ever asked how she was doing. The words lingered long after the conversation ended. Throughout the evening, Theron spoke with teachers, farmers, shop owners, and families. Every conversation revealed another story. Aurelia had paid for a young woman's college tuition after her parents passed away. She had helped organize winter food programs. She remembered birthdays. She wrote letters. She attended school performances. One teacher laughed while recalling how Aurelia spent nearly an hour helping a nervous first grader practice a reading assignment. The more stories Theron heard, the more impossible it became to reconcile them with the woman he thought he knew. He had loved Aurelia. Of that he was certain. Yet love without attention had left enormous pieces of her unseen. As darkness settled over Pine Hollow, a young boy approached him carrying a folded piece of paper. "This belongs to you," the child said. Theron accepted it carefully. "Who gave this to you?" "A lady with golden hair." His pulse quickened. "When?" "About 3 weeks ago." Theron unfolded the paper. It was a simple sketch. A mountain lake surrounded by pine trees beneath a crescent moon. Nothing else. No words. No explanation. Just the drawing. The boy pointed north. "She told me that if a tall man with silver eyes ever came looking for her, I should give him that." Theron stared at the sketch. His heart pounded for the first time since beginning the search. Aurelia knew he would follow. Somehow she had expected this moment. The lake looked familiar. After several seconds, recognition struck. Moonwater Lake, a remote location nearly 200 miles north of the capital. Aurelia had visited it years ago during a charity trip. She once described it as the quietest place she had ever seen. Theron folded the drawing carefully and slipped it inside his coat. For the first time since finding the ring, he felt something stronger than regret. Hope. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Aurelia had left a trail. And for the first time in 7 years, the distance between them seemed just a little smaller. The journey to Moonwater Lake took 4 days. Theron traveled through winding mountain roads, dense evergreen forests, and valleys painted gold by autumn. During the long hours in the saddle, he found himself haunted by memories he had ignored for years. Not royal ceremonies, not political victories. The memories that followed him were smaller. Aurelia laughing when a sudden rainstorm ruined a carefully planned garden event. Aurelia kneeling beside an injured bird until it was calm enough to fly away. Aurelia sitting quietly in the study long after midnight simply because she wanted to spend a few extra minutes near him. Every memory carried the same painful question. Why did they seem so precious only now? By the 5th morning, Moonwater Lake appeared between towering pines. The lake stretched across miles of untouched wilderness, reflecting the pale blue sky like a mirror. The sight immediately explained why Aurelia loved this place. There were no court politics here. No endless schedules. No expectations. Only stillness. Theron guided his horse into the small lakeside settlement nearby. The community consisted of a handful of cabins, a general store, and a dock extending into the water. Several residents recognized him immediately, yet none seemed surprised by his arrival. Instead, their expressions carried quiet understanding, as though they had expected him all along. The owner of the general store welcomed him inside. The older man smiled gently. "You finally came." Theron frowned. Aurelia was here? More than once. The shopkeeper reached beneath the counter and placed a small wooden box in front of him. She left this behind. Theron opened the box carefully. Inside rested dozens of folded notes. Some contained names. Others contained reminders. Many contained instructions for helping local families during the winter months. Even hundreds of miles from the palace, Aurelia had been taking care of people. Theron picked up one folded paper. A family needed assistance repairing their roof before snowfall. Another contained a list of books for children at the local school. Another included names of elderly residents who lived alone. The shopkeeper laughed softly. Most people come here to escape responsibility. She came here and found more. Theron smiled despite himself. That sounded exactly like Aurelia. As he prepared to leave, the shopkeeper hesitated. There is something else. He disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a worn leather journal. Theron recognized it immediately. Aurelia's journal. His pulse quickened. Where did you find this? She forgot it during a storm 3 years ago, the shopkeeper explained. When she came back for it, she told me to keep it safe. She said someone might need it one day. Theron opened the journal slowly. The entries stretched back years. Most described ordinary moments. Community projects. Village visits. Charity plans. Then he found an entry dated exactly 3 years earlier. His breath caught as he began reading. Tonight I packed my bags. I folded every dress. I packed every book that mattered. I even wrote the letter. The words blurred for a moment. Theron read them again. Tonight, I was ready to leave. My heart hurts too much to keep pretending everything is fine. I love him. I always will. But I do not think he sees me anymore. Theron gripped the journal tighter. His chest felt impossibly heavy. Aurelia had been ready to leave 3 years ago. 3 years. He continued reading. Then everything changed. News arrived that Theron had fallen ill during a diplomatic journey. The palace requested my return. So I unpacked everything. I burned the letter. I stayed. Theron closed his eyes. The mountain air suddenly felt difficult to breathe. Aurelia had already reached this crossroads once before. She had already found the strength to walk away. And she had chosen him instead. The next page contained one final sentence. I do not regret staying. I only hope one day he notices that I did. Theron stared at the words for a long time. The realization hit harder than anything he had discovered during his search. Aurelia had not left at the first sign of disappointment. She had not given up easily. She had given him another chance. Then another. Then another. For years she had remained beside him hoping things would change. Hoping he would notice. Hoping he would choose her before she finally chose herself. As the sun began setting across Moonwater Lake, Theron looked down and noticed something tucked inside the back cover of the journal. It was a small velvet ring box. His heart nearly stopped. He opened it carefully. Inside was an older wedding band. The first ring he had given Aurelia before the royal ceremony. The silver had faded with age, but she had kept it all these years. Beneath it rested a folded note written in her familiar handwriting. Some things matter because of what they mean. Theron stared at the ring as evening shadows stretched across the lake. For the first time since finding the wedding band on his desk, he understood something that changed everything. Aurelia had never stopped loving him, and somehow that made losing her hurt even more. That night, Theron remained beside Moonwater Lake long after darkness settled across the mountains. The old wedding band rested in his palm, while Aurelia's journal lay open beside him. The silver ring was simple, smaller than the ceremonial ring she had left behind on his desk. Less expensive, less impressive, yet somehow it felt more important. It had existed before crowns, before royal obligations, before the endless demands that slowly filled every corner of their lives. Theron turned the ring between his fingers. Aurelia had carried it for years, even after all the disappointments, even after all the lonely evenings. She had kept it. The realization hurt in a way he could not explain. People do not preserve things that mean nothing to them. Outside, moonlight shimmered across the lake's surface. The world was quiet except for the gentle sound of water against the shore. Theron opened the journal again. He found himself searching through older entries, hoping to understand the woman he had spent years overlooking. One page near the middle caught his attention immediately. The handwriting appeared uneven, as though written during a difficult moment. Today someone asked me why I wear 2 rings. I smiled and changed the subject. The truth is simple. One ring represents a kingdom. The other represents a promise. I never wanted to forget the difference. Theron stared at the words. His chest tightened. He remembered giving her that first ring. There had been no royal audience. No formal ceremony. Just the two of them standing beneath a summer sky while talking about the future. Back then, they had promised to choose each other every day. Somewhere along the way, he had started choosing responsibilities first and assuming Aurelia would always be there afterward. He continued reading. Several pages later, another entry stopped him completely. I think the hardest part is not feeling unloved. It is feeling invisible. Theron closed the journal. For several minutes, he simply sat there staring into the darkness. Invisible. The word echoed through his mind. Not unloved. Invisible. There was a difference. A painful difference. Because it meant Aurelia had never doubted his feelings. She doubted whether those feelings still mattered enough to shape his actions. Before dawn, Theron packed his belongings and prepared to leave. As he secured the journal inside his travel bag, something slipped from between the pages and landed on the floor. It was a folded map. His pulse quickened. He unfolded it carefully. Several locations had been marked in Aurelia's handwriting. Pine Hollow, Moonwater Lake, places he had already visited. Then his eyes moved farther west. One final location had been circled several times. Cedar Ridge. Theron recognized the name immediately. Years earlier, Aurelia had personally funded the construction of a retreat center hidden in the mountains. A place designed for teachers, caregivers, volunteers, and exhausted people who spent their lives helping others. Theron remembered attending the opening ceremony for less than an hour before rushing away to another meeting. Aurelia had remained there for 3 days. At the bottom of the map, a note had been written in careful script. Sometimes people need a place to remember who they are. Theron folded the map slowly. The message felt deliberate. Not an accident. Not a coincidence. Aurelia had left a trail. Not because she wanted to be chased by a king. Because she wanted him to understand something before he found her. Every location carried a lesson. Every clue revealed another truth about her life. The search was no longer about discovering where she went. It was about discovering why she left. As the first light of morning touched the mountains, Theron mounted his horse and turned west toward Cedar Ridge. Yet before leaving, he looked down once more at the old ring resting in his hand. The worn silver reflected the sunrise. For years he had believed the wedding band on Aurelia's finger symbolized their marriage. Now he understood that the smaller ring mattered even more. It represented the version of themselves that existed before titles, expectations, and distance. The version that had loved each other without conditions. Theron slipped the ring carefully into his coat pocket, close to his heart. Then he began riding towards Cedar Ridge, carrying something far heavier than regret. For the first time, he carried the growing realization that Aurelia had been giving him directions back to her heart all along. He had simply been too distracted to notice. The road to Cedar Ridge felt different this time. Theron no longer rode with the desperate urgency of a man chasing someone who had disappeared. Instead, he traveled with the uneasy understanding of a man slowly discovering the truth about himself. Every mile seemed to strip away another excuse he had carried for years. The kingdom needed him. The people depended on him. There would be time later. Those explanations had once sounded reasonable. Now they felt hollow. By late afternoon on the third day, Cedar Ridge emerged from the mountains. The retreat center rested on a hillside overlooking a valley painted with autumn colors. Stone cottages sat among winding paths lined with flowers and cedar trees. Wind chimes swayed gently in the breeze. The place radiated a sense of peace that immediately reminded him of Aurelia. Here, there were no royal schedules, no formal ceremonies, no endless meetings, only quiet moments and room to breathe. As Theron entered the property, several residents greeted him politely, but without surprise. It was almost as if news of his search had traveled ahead of him. Near one of the gardens, a woman in her 60s arranged flowers into baskets. She looked up, smiled softly, and said, "You are a little later than she hoped." Theron stopped. "You know Aurelia?" "Very well." The woman brushed soil from her hands. "My name is Evelyn." Theron recognized the name immediately from Aurelia's notes. Evelyn had managed Cedar Ridge since its opening. "Is she here?" The question left his mouth before he could stop it. Evelyn studied him carefully. Then she shook her head. Not anymore. The answer struck harder than he expected. Once again, he had arrived too late. Evelyn motioned toward a nearby bench overlooking the valley. "Walk with me." They followed a winding stone path through gardens filled with late-season flowers. Eventually, they reached a quiet overlook where the mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Evelyn sat on a wooden bench and gestured for Theron to join her. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Evelyn broke the silence. "Do you know what Aurelia did during her first day here?" Theron shook his head. "She slept for 14 hours. A small smile touched Evelyn's face. The second day, she walked through the forest. The third day, she sat beside a stream and watched the water. Theron listened quietly. And after that, Evelyn looked toward the mountains. She cried. The word landed heavily. Aurelia rarely cried. In 7 years of marriage, Theron could count on one hand the number of times he had seen tears in her eyes. Why, he asked. Evelyn gave him a knowing look. Because she was finally somewhere she did not have to be strong. Silence settled between them. Theron stared at the valley below. The image of Aurelia sitting alone beside a stream, carrying years of exhaustion nobody noticed, twisted painfully inside his chest. Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded letter. She left this in case you came. Theron accepted it carefully. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Theron, if you are reading this, then you are closer than I expected. I wonder if you have begun seeing the pattern yet. Every place you have visited mattered to me for the same reason. Not because they were beautiful, not because they were peaceful, because they reminded me who I was. Theron continued reading. For years, I became whatever everyone needed me to be. Luna, advisor, organizer, caregiver, supporter. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to simply be Aurelia. The words struck him deeply. He remembered all the titles people used when speaking about her. Luna Aurelia, her grace, the king's mate. Rarely did anyone simply call her Aurelia. He turned the page and found a final message. If you have reached Cedar Ridge, there is one last place you need to visit. Not because it will help you find me, because it will help you remember us. At the bottom of the letter was a single location. Sunrise Point. Theron stared at the name. His breath caught instantly. Of all the places in the kingdom, that location held some of his happiest memories. Years ago, before responsibilities consumed their lives, he and Aurelia had climbed those cliffs together before dawn. They had watched the sunrise while talking about dreams, family, and the future. Back when choosing each other felt effortless. Evelyn watched his expression and smiled gently. She hoped you would remember. Theron folded the letter carefully. As the evening sun dipped below the mountains, he looked toward the distant western horizon. For the first time since leaving the palace, he felt certain he understood what Aurelia had been doing. She was not hiding from him. She was leading him backward through the pieces of her life he had never truly noticed. And somewhere beyond the mountains, at the place where some of their happiest memories began, the final answer was waiting. The climb to Sunrise Point began before dawn. Theron followed a narrow mountain trail illuminated only by moonlight and the occasional break in the clouds. The air grew colder with every step upward. Wind moved through the pines with a low whisper that seemed to carry fragments of old memories. Years ago, he and Aurelia had climbed this same path laughing about the future. Back then, neither of them imagined how much life could change. By the time the first pale light appeared along the horizon, Theron reached the overlook. His heart pounded as he scanned the cliffs, the trees, and the open expanse beyond. Empty. There was no sign of Aurelia. No movement. No familiar figure standing beneath the cedar tree where they once watched the sunrise together. For several moments, he simply stood there. Then he noticed something resting on a flat stone near the edge of the overlook. A folded letter. His chest tightened instantly. Slowly, he crossed the distance and picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Aurelia. The mountain wind tugged gently at his coat as he unfolded the paper. Theron, if you are reading this, then you came. I was never certain you would. He stared at the words. The sunrise slowly brightened the sky while his eyes moved across the page. I spent years waiting for conversations that never happened, waiting for time that never arrived, waiting for promises to become priorities. I do not blame you anymore. The sentence felt like a knife wrapped in kindness. Aurelia continued. Letting go of blame was the only way I could find peace. Theron lowered the letter for a moment. The overlook suddenly felt enormous and unbearably quiet. He had crossed mountains, forests, and half the kingdom believing he was getting closer to her. Yet now he stood alone. He continued reading. If you have reached this place, then perhaps you finally understand what I needed all along. Not perfection, not grand gestures, just presence, just partnership, just the feeling that I mattered as much as everything else. Theron closed his eyes briefly. Every lesson from the journey returned at once. The villages, the letters, the journal, the forgotten sacrifices, the old ring. Aurelia had never demanded more love. She had only wanted to feel chosen. At the bottom of the page, one final sentence waited. Some people spend years searching for the person they love. The harder journey is becoming the person that love deserves. The letter slipped slightly in his hands. For the first time since leaving the palace, fear truly settled inside him. Not fear that Aurelia was gone. Fear that he might have arrived too late. The realization hit with unexpected force. What if this was goodbye? What if the clues had never been invitations? What if they were simply lessons she wanted him to learn before moving on with her life? Theron stared across the endless mountains. The sunrise painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt hollow. A voice broke the silence behind him. You look exactly like someone who finally understands. Theron turned so quickly, he nearly dropped the letter. An elderly woman stood a few yards away beside the trail. She carried a walking stick and wore a thick wool coat against the morning cold. Her expression was gentle but knowing. Who are you? Theron asked. An old friend. She smiled faintly. Aurelia spent several afternoons speaking with me. Hope flickered painfully inside his chest. Where is she? The woman studied him for a long moment before answering. She is waiting. Theron barely breathed. Waiting where? The woman pointed toward a distant ridge visible beyond the valley. Nestled among the trees stood a small stone chapel. Theron remembered it immediately. Years ago, during their first year of marriage, he and Aurelia had visited it while traveling through the mountains. They had spent an entire afternoon there talking about dreams they hoped to build together. She said that if you reached Sunrise Point, you might finally be ready for the last conversation. Theron looked toward the chapel. The building seemed impossibly far away and yet closer than Aurelia had been in weeks. He glanced down at the letter one final time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it beside the old ring inside his coat. As the morning sun climbed higher above the mountains, he began walking toward the chapel carrying equal parts hope and heartbreak. For the first time since finding the wedding band on his desk, he truly did not know how the story would end. The chapel stood quietly among the pines as though it had been waiting for years. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the stone walls in warm shades of gold. Theron followed the narrow path leading to the entrance, his heart heavier with every step. During the journey across the kingdom, he had imagined this moment countless times. In some versions, Aurelia welcomed him with a smile. In others, she turned away. Now that he was finally here, he realized he had no idea what would happen next. He only knew that for the first time in many years, he was prepared to hear the truth, even if it hurt. The chapel door stood slightly open. Theron paused before entering. Through the doorway, he could see rows of simple wooden benches illuminated by soft morning light. Fresh wildflowers rested beside the windows. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and lavender. Then he saw her. Aurelia sat alone near the front of the chapel. Sunlight touched her golden hair as she gazed quietly through a stained glass window. For several seconds, Theron simply stood there. Not because he was afraid she would disappear. Because after everything he had learned, everything he had remembered, and everything he regretted, seeing her again felt almost overwhelming. Slowly, Aurelia turned. Their eyes met. Neither spoke. There was no dramatic reunion. No rush across the room. Only two people looking at each other with the weight of 7 years between them. Aurelia offered a small smile. You found the chapel. Theron nodded. You always did leave difficult clues. A quiet laugh escaped her. The sound immediately brought back memories of happier days. For a moment, the years seemed to disappear. Then reality returned. Aurelia looked down at her hands. I was not sure you would come this far. Theron stepped closer. Neither was I. The honesty of the answer surprised them both. Aurelia studied him carefully. There was something different in her eyes now. Not distance. Not anger. Caution. The kind that appears after someone has been disappointed too many times. Theron understood immediately. Promises would not be enough. Words alone could not rebuild what had been neglected. Aurelia looked toward the stained glass window again. Do you know why I chose this place? Theron glanced around the chapel. Memories surfaced instantly. Their first visit. The afternoon, they spent talking for hours about the future. The dreams they carried before life became complicated. Because we were happy here, he said quietly. Aurelia nodded. Because we were ourselves here. Silence settled between them. Theron reached into his coat and removed the small velvet box containing the original ring. The worn silver caught the morning light. Aurelia's eyes widened slightly. You found it. Theron looked down at the ring. I found much more than that. He walked toward the front row and placed the box gently on a nearby bench. Then he turned back to her. I spent years believing love was something you felt. His voice remained calm. This journey taught me that love is something you do. Aurelia listened without interrupting. I loved you, he continued. But too often I expected that to be enough. He lowered his gaze briefly. It was not. Emotion flickered across her face. Theron took a slow breath. I cannot change the years behind us. He looked directly into her eyes. But I can change the years ahead. Aurelia was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked the question that mattered most. How do I know? The simplicity of it nearly broke his heart. Not because she doubted his feelings. Because she had learned not to trust promises. Theron smiled softly. You do not. Aurelia blinked. He continued. Not today. He gestured toward the chapel door and the mountains beyond. You will know because of what happens afterward. The answer seemed to catch her off guard. Theron looked toward the sunlight streaming through the windows. One conversation cannot fix 7 years. One promise cannot erase 7 years. The only thing I can offer is consistency. Tears gathered in Aurelia's eyes. She looked away for a moment, gathering herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I still love you. Theron felt his breath catch. Aurelia smiled sadly. That was never the problem. Silence filled the chapel. The words settled between them with quiet power. Loving you is easy, she continued softly. Waiting for you is hard. Theron closed his eyes briefly. Of everything he had learned during his journey, nothing hurt more than hearing that truth spoken aloud. Aurelia stepped forward and opened the velvet box. She lifted the old ring from its place and turned it slowly between her fingers. I kept this because it reminded me of who we used to be. Theron nodded. I carried it because it reminded me of who we could become. For a moment, neither moved. Then Aurelia looked at him, really looked at him, as though searching for the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Whatever she saw there seemed to ease something inside her. Slowly, she reached for his hand. Theron closed his fingers around hers. No grand speeches followed. No dramatic declarations. Just a simple choice made by two people who finally understood what they almost lost. 1 year later, the royal study looked very different. Reports still covered the desk. Responsibilities still existed. The kingdom still required leadership. Yet when a soft knock sounded at the door, Theron immediately set down his pen. Aurelia entered carrying 2 cups of tea. He smiled, stood, and crossed the room without hesitation. Together they walked toward the palace gardens as unfinished paperwork remained behind. The documents could wait. For years, Aurelia had been the one waiting. Not anymore.